January 6th, 1872, New York, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A hum fills the lobby of the grandiose Grand Central Hotel on Broadway. It is the sound of money. Deals are struck here, silks of ladies' dresses rustle, and crystal glasses chime. None of those present yet knows that in a moment, this noise will be sliced by two dry, deafening shots that will forever change the history of Wall Street. A man ascends the wide, carpeted staircase designated for the ladies' entrance. He is impossible to miss. He is enormous. His weight approaches 130 kilograms. He wears a velvet cloak with satin lining, and on his shirt front gleams a diamond whose single cost could feed a New York slum for a year. This is James Fisk, Jr. Friends call him Jim. Enemies call him an unscrupulous scoundrel. Newspaper writers dub him the Prince of Erie, or Diamond Jim. He is the king of New York. He owns railroads, steamships, an opera house, and, as he himself believes, the state's judicial system. In his pockets lie the fates of thousands of investors. He heads upward, confident in his invulnerability, like a rhinoceros crossing the savannah. But he is awaited at the top step. There stands another man. He is young, handsome, trim. He wears an elegant coat tailored by the city's finest tailor. His name is Edward Stokes. Society columns call him the oil heir and a notorious playboy. Just yesterday, he and Jim Fisk were drinking champagne and sharing the same woman. Today, Edward Stokes draws a 4-barreled Colt House revolver from his pocket. At this moment, time stops for America's richest adventurer. Stokes delivers no long speeches. Eyewitnesses will later testify in court that they heard only a short phrase, "Now you're in my hands." The first bullet strikes Fisk in the left arm. The second enters the abdomen, pierces the intestine, and lodges in the thigh bone. The bulk of the great financial manipulator, the man who, together with Jay Gould, nearly crashed the U.S. economy on Black Friday, crumples onto the steps. He tries to rise, but his legs will not obey. His famous diamond is flooded with dark, thick blood. The paradox of this scene is monstrous. A man whose personal fortune is valued, by the most modest estimates, at $2.5 million of that era, a sum equivalent to roughly 75 million modern dollars, dies not in his golden bed. He writhes on the dirty floor of the hotel corridor like a dock worker shot in a drunken brawl. All his lawyers, all his bought judges, all his hired thugs are powerless against a piece of lead weighing just a few grams. When word of the shots spreads through the city, New York freezes. This is not just a murder. This is the fall of a colossus. Newspapers issue extras every hour. A crowd surrounds the hotel, greedily catching every rumor. People feel a strange mix of horror and glee. It is that very feeling which the Germans call Schadenfreude. Spectators loved to hate Jim Fisk. He was the living embodiment of all the vice that the Gilded Age carried within it. He was the symbol of money replacing morality. And now, watching as he is carried out on a stretcher, every clerk earning $10 a week feels grim satisfaction. Money did not save the Prince of Erie. His funeral will become one of the most lavish in New York history. Thousands of soldiers from the 9th Regiment of the National Guard, of which he appointed himself colonel, will march down Broadway. Orchestras will play funeral marches. Store windows will be draped in black crepe. But behind all this pomp will hide one dirty, unsightly truth. Jim Fisk was killed not because of millions, not because of railroads, and not because of politics. He was killed because of a woman whose reputation was worth less than a bottle of wine on his table. And because of money, he tried to take from a former friend. Today, if you walk through Manhattan, at the corner of 23rd Street and 8th Avenue, you will see a massive building with a appealing facade. It houses cheap clothing stores and residential apartments. People hurry past, buried in their smartphones, and do not even suspect that they are passing by a palace. This is the Grand Opera House, Jim Fisk's former residence, the place where, in offices with oak paneling, the fates of the country were decided, and in the dressing rooms below, dramas more intense than Shakespearean ones played out. Above the entrance, if you look closely, you can still see the letters ER, Erie Railroad. The Erie Railroad. This is the only thing left from the empire of the man who wanted to buy the whole world, but in the end got only a bullet in the abdomen and a plot in the cemetery in Brattleboro. How did it come to this? How did the son of a simple peddler become America's most hated and adored tycoon? Where did these millions come from that he squandered so wastefully? And why did Edward Stokes, heir to a good family, decide to pull the trigger in broad daylight? To understand this, we need to rewind the tape. Not to the moment of death, but to the moment when greed first knocked on the door of young Jim Fisk. We are heading to the beginning of the path. At a time when America was still different, and the rules were written by those with the loudest voice and the heaviest wallet. James Fisk was born on April 1st, 1835, in the state of Vermont. The date of his birth itself, April Fool's Day, seems like a cruel irony of fate. But Jim was never a fool. He was the son of a peddler. His childhood smelled of road dust and horse sweat. In those years, peddling was a harsh trade. You take a cart, load it with cheap calico, pots, and needles, and drag it from farm to farm, hoping to trade this junk for a couple of coins. Most peddlers looked like tramps, but not Jim Fisk. Already then, in his youth, he understood the main secret of capitalism, which many modern marketers try to sell as a revelation. Packaging is more important than content. Jim painted his father's cart in bright colors, adorned the horse harness with polished brass, and put on the best suit he could find. When his wagon rolled into a sleepy provincial town, it was an event. Farmers flocked, not for the goods, but for the show. Fisk joked, told tall tales, and sold the same pots at 3 times the price, simply because he presented them with the smile of a performer. He understood. People don't pay for the product. People pay for the emotion. For a time, he worked in Van Amberg's traveling circus. There he learned to care for elephants and sell tickets to shows that didn't exist. The circus taught him that the audience wants to be deceived, if the deception is beautiful enough. Later, he would bring this circus aesthetic to boardroom meetings, turning boring accounting into tricks with disappearing millions. But real capital, the very foundation on which dynasties are built, is rarely earned by honest labor. For takeoff, a catastrophe is needed. For Jim Fisk, such a catastrophe was the American Civil War. While thousands of young Americans were dying of gangrene and bayonet wounds on the fields of Gettysburg and Antietam, Jim Fisk was making money. He got a job at the Boston firm Jordan Marsh. The Northern armies needed blankets, uniforms, and cotton. Cotton grew in the South, which was cut off by the front line. Its price skyrocketed. Fisk organized a scheme that today would be called treason. He sneaked into occupied territories, bought cotton dirt cheap from desperate planters, and shipped it north, selling it to the government with markups of hundreds of %. This was a bloody business.
Every dollar in Fisk's pocket
was paid for by someone's death or the prolongation of the war. But his accounting books knew no morality. They knew only debit and credit. By the end of the war, he was rich. He bought a partnership in the firm, but Boston was too cramped for him. The prim society of New England looked at him as a vulgar upstart. He needed a city where conscience costs less and opportunities are boundless. He needed New York. In 1864, Fisk arrives on Wall Street. At first, Wall Street chewed him up and spat him out. He lost almost everything earned on speculations. This was a classic lesson for a newcomer. Don't play cards with cheats if you don't know marked decks. But Fisk did not break. He found himself a mentor. This mentor was Daniel Drew. Drew was a legend and a monster of the financial world. A deeply religious old man who could pray for hours in church, then go out and ruin 1,000 investors without batting an eye. Drew saw in the fat, noisy, and unscrupulous Fisk the perfect tool. Fisk was a battering ram. He had no reputation worth preserving, and he had the energy of an atomic reactor. Together, they started one of the dirtiest games in American economic history. They did not build railroads to carry freight. They used railroad stocks as chips in a casino. Fisk realized that real assets, rails, locomotives, stations, were just ballast. Real money is made on stock price fluctuations, which can be artificially created. He restored his fortune and multiplied it many times over. By 30, the former circus performer and pot peddler sat in a luxurious office surrounded by lackeys. He no longer sold blankets. He sold air. But this air was worth millions. He developed the first signs of that megalomania that would lead him to the grave. He began buying not just things, but symbols of power. But most importantly, he met the man who would become his second self and evil genius, Jay Gould. Together, this trio, Drew, Fisk, and Gould, prepared to carry out a takeover that would enter history textbooks as the Erie War. Fisk looked at New York from the window of his carriage and saw not a city, but a huge, glittering store where everything, absolutely everything, has a price. All that remained was to pull out the wallet. He did not yet know that the price of some things would turn out to be higher than the sum of all American bank accounts. 1868. New York becomes the arena for a battle that would later be called the Erie War. This is not just a corporate conflict. This is a clash of tectonic plates. On one side is Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, the man who owns most of America's railroads. He is old, he is ruthless, and he is accustomed to getting everything on which his gaze falls. He decided to buy the Erie Railroad to establish a complete monopoly on transportation. He throws millions of dollars onto the exchange, snapping up every available share. His logic is simple. If I buy it all, the company will be mine. But on the other side of the barricades sit Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, and they have a plan whose audacity borders on suicide. They understand that they cannot outbuy Vanderbilt. His pockets are bottomless. So they decide to change the laws of physics. While Vanderbilt buys shares, Fisk and Gould fire up a printing press in the basement of their office. They literally print new stock certificates, the ink on which has not yet dried when they flood the market. This was madness. Vanderbilt spent millions thinking he was acquiring a controlling stake, while Fisk simply diluted his share by issuing tons of new paper. "If this press breaks down, we're finished," Fisk laughed. pouring oil into the mechanism. In the end, the Commodore spent $7 million of that era, more than $200 million today, on buying air. When he realized he'd been duped by two upstarts, his rage was terrible. He issued a warrant for their arrest through a compliant judge, and here begins, perhaps, the most surreal episode in American business history. Fisk, Gould, and Old Man Drew, stuffing their suitcases with cash and accounting books, flee New York under cover of night. They cross the Hudson into the state of New Jersey, where New York police jurisdiction does not apply. They seize the Taylor Hotel in Jersey City and turn it into a fortress dubbed Fort Taylor. Imagine this scene. 3 of the country's richest men sit in a hotel room, surrounded by an army of hired thugs with clubs, while 3 cannons are positioned on the embankment, aimed toward Manhattan. Fisk was in his element. He gave interviews, drank champagne, and posed like a general in exile. Gould, pale and silent, wove his web. While Jim entertained the press, Jay Gould went to Albany, the state capital, with a suitcase containing $500,000. He simply bought the New York State Legislature. The senators passed a law that retroactively legalized their fake shares. They won. Vanderbilt, for the first time in his life, admitted defeat. "Never kick a skunk," he said then about Fisk. From this moment begins the true Gilded Age of Jim Fisk. He and Gould seized control of the Erie Railroad and moved the headquarters to that very Grand Opera House building on 23rd Street. This was their Olympus. On the second floor were the railroad management offices, paneled in walnut and gold. There stood safes stuffed with investors' money, and right beneath them was the Opera House. Jim Fisk blurred the line between business and show. He became managing director of both the railroad and the theater. He personally selected actresses for the corps de ballet, and the selection criterion was certainly not vocal talent. He bought a steamship line running to Long Branch for one purpose only. He wanted to wear a uniform. Fisk ordered an admiral's uniform with gold epaulettes, though he had never served in the Navy. He greeted guests at the gangway, saluting, and demanded to be called Admiral. The public poked fun at him, but it was laughter mixed with admiration. He was living proof that in America, anything is possible. His office in the Grand Opera House was the embodiment of tastelessness and luxury. The walls were adorned with frescoes of half-naked nymphs. Hundreds of canaries sang in cages. Fisk adored their singing, claiming it drowned out the noise of conscience, if he had one at all. He hosted banquets where oysters soaked in champagne were served, and pies with live birds inside. The contrast between the partners was striking. Jay Gould was the brain of the operation. Quiet, family man, suffering from stomach pains, he worked 20 hours a day, devising takeover schemes. Jim Fisk was the facade. Loud, vulgar, always surrounded by women. Gould used Fisk like a bright rag to distract the bull, public opinion, and regulators, while he himself emptied investors' pockets. In those years, Fisk felt immortal. He rode through Central Park in a carriage drawn by a 6-horse team, 2 white and 4 black, while courtesans laden with jewels sat beside him. He bought out a regiment of the National Guard and became its colonel, just to have another uniform and the chance to ride horseback in parades. But it was precisely at this moment of absolute triumph, when money flowed like a river and laws were written to dictation, that 2 characters appeared in the life of the Prince of Erie, who would become harbingers of his downfall. One, a woman with the ambitions of an actress but the talent of a predator. The other, a man from old money who envied Fisk's brilliance. The empire, built on deception and printer's ink, seemed unshakable. But rot had already begun to eat away at the foundation. Fisk thought he had bought everything: judges, politicians, the press. But he forgot that human passions, jealousy, wounded pride, and thirst for revenge are not sold on the exchange. And the price he would have to pay for his entertainments could not be covered by any check. In the doors of the Grand Opera House already stood the shadow of future tragedy. But amid the roar of the orchestra and the clink of coins, Jim Fisk did not hear it. New York at the end of the 1860s was a city of invisible walls. These walls were built not of brick, but of snobbery, pedigrees, and unwritten rules guarded more fiercely than a state border. On one side of the street lived those called old money, the Astors, Stuyvesants, Livingstons. They spoke quietly, dressed restrainedly, and believed that a name should appear in the society columns only 3 times: at birth, at the wedding, and in the obituary. On the other side raged new money, vulgar, loud, smelling of oil, coal, and slaughterhouses. Jim Fisk, despite his millions and admiral's uniform, remained a dirty peddler from Vermont to high society. The doors of elite clubs, such as the Union Club, were tightly closed to him. When his carriage passed down Fifth Avenue, matrons in drawing rooms ordered servants to draw the curtains, as if the plague were rushing by. This humiliation burned Fisk from within more than he was ready to admit. He desperately wanted love and recognition. If New York's patricians would not let him into their palaces, he decided to build his own world, where he would be the sole king, judge, and arbiter of fashion. It was precisely at this moment that a woman appeared in the equation who would become the catalyst of the catastrophe. Her name was Helen Josephine Mansfield, but history would remember her as Josie. She was not an innocent debutante. She was a divorced actress who arrived from California with empty pockets and enormous ambitions. Contemporaries described her as a woman with lush forms and eyes in which one could read the price of any man. For prim society, a connection with her was social suicide. For Jim Fisk, she became a trophy. He housed her in a 4-story brownstone mansion at West 23rd Street, number 359. This was a strategic decision. Josie's house was just a few dozen meters from the Grand Opera House. Malicious tongues claimed that an underground tunnel had been dug between the theater and the mistress's house, so that the Prince of Erie could visit his favorite without catching reporters' eyes. But Jim didn't need tunnels. He was proud of this connection. He showered Josie with Erie Railroad shareholders' money as if it were confetti. Monthly allowance, payment for servants, bills for dresses from Paris, all this was covered by company checks. He turned her into a semblance of a queen for his pocket kingdom. But this idyll lacked a third element, the one who would embody true chic, inaccessible to a peddler's son. And this element entered their life in the person of Edward Stokes. Ned Stokes was the complete opposite of Fisk. He came from a wealthy Philadelphia family. He was tall, slim, educated, and possessed that innate aristocratic insolence which cannot be bought. Stokes was a predator with the manners of a prince. He owned an oil refinery in Brooklyn and needed a patron. Fisk, blinded by the shine of old money, saw a friend in Stokes. He thought he was buying a ticket to high society. In reality, he let a fox into the henhouse. The deal they made was cynical to the extreme. Fisk invested money in Stokes's oil business, essentially giving him the capital. In return, Stokes became a regular guest in Fisk's opera box and at banquets. They became inseparable. The fat, diamond-bedecked Fisk and the elegant, cold Stokes. People called them Beauty and the Beast, and no one doubted who was who. But while Fisk enjoyed the illusion of friendship, Stokes began his game. He quickly realized that Josie Mansfield was bored with her corpulent and noisy patron. Stokes was young, handsome, and cynical, the perfect combination for a woman like Josie. The classic triangle began, as old as the world. Fisk paid for the banquet, and Stokes enjoyed the dessert. While Jim was busy with manipulations on the exchange, Ned Stokes spent evenings in the house on 23rd Street, which Fisk paid for. The social war reached its peak in September 1869, on the day that entered history as Black Friday. Fisk and Gould tried to buy up all the gold in the country to drive up prices. This was an attack on the very foundation of the U.S. economy. The gold price skyrocketed, ruining banks, farmers, and merchants. On that day, Jim Fisk became the most hated man in America. An enraged crowd stormed Wall Street with ropes in hand, demanding to hang the speculators. Fisk had to barricade himself in his opera house under the guard of armed thugs. For high society, this became the last straw. Fisk finally turned into an outcast. He was locked in the golden cage of his theater, surrounded only by paid friends and a mistress who had already betrayed him. He thought he was holding God by the beard, but in reality, he was lonelier than ever. And it was precisely at this moment of vulnerability, when the outside world thirsted for his blood, that the blow was struck from within. Edward Stokes, seeing that Fisk's reputation was collapsing, decided it was time to take not only the woman, but also the money. He began turning Josie against her benefactor, whispering to her that Fisk was a sinking ship. "Why do you need this clown when there's a real gentleman right here?" This question hung in the perfume-scented air of the bedroom on 23rd Street. Thus began a war not for millions, but for wounded male pride. Fisk, accustomed to buying everything, suddenly discovered that his investments in friendship and love had depreciated faster than stocks on Black Friday. He did not yet know that his protege was already preparing a blackmail plan, using his own letters. The social ladder up which Fisk had so diligently climbed turned out to be a scaffold. By the beginning of 1870, the romantic operetta had finally turned into a courtroom thriller. The moment when Jim Fisk realized he had been betrayed was not a dramatic scene with breaking dishes. It was the moment when the accounting balance no longer tallied. He learned that the money he allocated for maintaining Josie's house was actually going to support his rival. Ned Stokes did not just sleep with his woman. He lived off Fisk, drank his wine, and smoked his cigars. For the Prince of Erie, this was not just an insult to honor. It was a violation of the laws of business. And in business, Fisk took no prisoners. The counterstrike was delivered with the same ruthless efficiency with which Fisk and Gould ruined competitors on the exchange. He simply turned off the tap. Josie's bills stopped being paid. Creditors, who had previously bowed to her, knowing who stood behind her, now began knocking on doors demanding repayment of debts for furniture and jewelry. But the main blow was intended for Ned Stokes. Stokes had only one serious asset, an oil refinery in Brooklyn. This business generated income only under one condition. Oil had to be delivered from Pennsylvania to New York quickly and cheaply. And the only way to do that was to use the Erie Railroad. Jim Fisk, as managing director, gave a simple order: do not load Stokes's tank cars. This was economic strangulation. Stokes's refinery shut down, oil rotted in barrels, workers were laid off, and revenues fell to zero. Fisk used his corporate power like a club to crush a personal enemy. Stokes was ruined, He lost his business, lost his income, and, most terribly for a man of his circle, lost face. A cornered aristocrat is more dangerous than a street thug. Stokes and Josie realized they had only one commodity left to sell: the reputation of Jim Fisk. In their hands was a packet of letters, those very famous letters that Jim wrote to Josie in moments of sentimental weakness. There was nothing criminal in them, no corruption, no admissions of financial manipulations. There was something worse for a man posing as the Napoleon of Wall Street. There was puppy-like tenderness and foolishness. He signed them, "Your Pudgy," or "Your Faithful Jim." He wrote with grammatical errors, complained of fatigue, and begged for a meeting. If these letters had gotten into the newspapers, the great and terrible Diamond Jim, the terror of the exchange, would have turned into a laughingstock. In the era of Victorian morality, where outward facade meant everything, publishing such correspondence would have been social death. Stokes went all in. He presented the bill. This was, perhaps, the most cynical deal of that time. He demanded $200,000 for the return of the letters. In modern terms, that's about $6 million. $6 million for a packet of paper with words of love. Fisk, accustomed to buying off judges and politicians, dug in this time. The peddler's pride flared up in him. "I won't pay for my own words," he shouted in the office at the Grand Opera House. But his partners, including the cold-blooded Jay Gould, advised paying. They didn't need the noise. Grueling negotiations began. Lawyers from both sides met in smoke-filled rooms at Delmonico's restaurant, haggling over each letter as if they were blue-chip stocks. In the end, a shaky truce was reached. Fisk agreed to pay $15,000, about $500,000 in modern money, in exchange for part of the letters and a guarantee that Stokes would disappear from his life. The money was handed over. But, as often happens with blackmailers, appetite comes with eating. Stokes spent the received sum in a few weeks on gambling debts and found himself broke again. He realized he had undersold. Josie still had a few more letters. And then Stokes decided to go all the way. He threatened not just to publish the correspondence, but to sue Fisk for libel, claiming that Fisk had destroyed his business through illegal methods. This was open war. January 1872 began with court hearings. The newspapers rejoiced. Headlines screamed, "King of Erie versus his Cleopatra." The public queued from 5 a.m. to get into the courtroom. There, under oath, the maid, Emma Keislich, began testifying about what happened behind the closed doors of the mansion on 23rd Street. The dirty laundry of New York's most famous trio was aired before the whole country. Fisk was furious, but he held confident. He believed his army of lawyers would crush Stokes. He hired the city's best attorneys to destroy his former friend. For Saturday, January 6th, the decisive hearing was scheduled. Stokes understood he was losing. The judge, probably bribed or simply sympathetic to the influential Fisk, was leaning toward dismissing Stokes's suit and possibly even charging him with extortion. That morning, Edward Stokes had breakfast in a restaurant, drank a glass of wine, and realized his life was falling apart. He had no money, his name was disgraced, and the man he considered a vulgar fatso was about to celebrate victory. The deal of the century had fallen through. The title of winner was slipping from his hands. Only one argument remained, one that required no lawyers or judges. Stokes rose from the table, felt the cold steel of the revolver in his coat pocket, and headed to the Grand Central Hotel. He knew Fisk would be there. The Prince of Erie was going to visit the widow of an acquaintance and, according to rumors, hand her money. Fisk rode toward his death in an open carriage, waving to passers-by, absolutely convinced that the worst thing was newspaper caricatures. He did not understand that the rules of the game had changed. Where money ends, blood begins. Before we return to the lobby of the Grand Central Hotel, where Edward Stokes is already gripping the revolver in his pocket, we need to understand exactly what James Fisk was losing. To grasp the scale of his fall, we must see the height to which he had climbed. His power had a physical embodiment, and that embodiment had an address. The corner of 23rd Street and 8th Avenue. Grand Opera House. This building was not just a headquarters. It was an architectural manifesto of the Gilded Age. Fisk bought this theater in 1869 for $820,000, a sum equivalent to about 25 million modern dollars. But the purchase was only the beginning. He poured hundreds of thousands more into reconstruction, turning the building into an impregnable fortress of luxury amid the dirty, horse manure-strewn New York. The building's facade was made of white marble, which had to be washed every week so that the city's coal stove soot did not turn it into gray stone. But the real magic began inside. To reach the Holy of Holies, the Erie Railroad offices on the second floor, a visitor had to pass through massive oak doors adorned with bronze casting. These doors were so heavy that special doormen in liveries with gold braid opened them. Ascending the wide staircase carpeted with a 3-inch thick rug in which heels sank, the guest entered a world where there was no day or night. The light from gas jets reflected in crystal chandeliers, each of which cost as much as a good suburban house. The walls were paneled in black walnut and mahogany, imported from the southern states. Italian masters painted the ceilings, depicting allegories of progress, commerce, and, of course, fortune. Jim Fisk's own office was the epicenter of this madness. It was a space designed to overwhelm. A massive desk on lion's paws towered on a special platform, so that Fisk, sitting in his chair, looked down on visitors. Behind his back hung portraits of himself in various guises: colonel, admiral, financial genius. But the most telling detail was not the decor, but the room's engineering feature. A secret door led from the office straight to the director's box in the opera house below. Fisk could at any moment escape boring freight reports and find himself in a world of music and applause. Business and show business were one and the same for him. But behind this facade lurked a cold, echoing emptiness. The house that Fisk built resembled a museum in which one could not live. Eyewitnesses recalled that the vast halls of the Grand Opera House were always cold, despite fireplaces in which anthracite burned around the clock. Marble drew warmth from people. Footstep sounds died in heavy portieres. This was the architecture of loneliness. The life of the servants in this palace was organized like a complex clockwork mechanism. Fisk's staff included dozens of people whose positions sounded absurd for democratic America. He had a special person responsible for cleaning his diamonds. Every morning, the servant laid out rings and pins on a velvet tray, wiping them with alcohol and chamois. There was a valet whose sole task was to ensure that there was not a single wrinkle on Fisk's colonel's uniform. There were coachmen who had to wash the white horses with special shampoo so that their coats gleamed in the light of gas lamps. These people saw what was hidden from the public. They saw how the Prince of Erie returned to his chambers after yet another banquet. They saw how the corset was removed from him. Yes, the corpulent Fisk wore a corset to appear slimmer, and how his body, freed from the shackles of vanity, sprawled in the chair. They saw his face when the mask of the Joker fell off. It was the face of a mortally tired man who panicked at the thought of silence. Silence was Fisk's main enemy. That is why his reception room was always crowded with people. Petitioners, actors, stockbrokers, shady dealers. He needed constant movement, constant noise, to drown out the inner voice insisting that all this was just scenery. He surrounded himself with hundreds of canaries in gilded cages placed throughout the office. Their chirping created an illusion of life, an illusion of spring amid the winter of his anxieties. But the smell of bird droppings, mixed with the aroma of expensive cigars and French perfumes, created a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The building had another zone, about which people whispered, but few had seen. These were private apartments fitted right in the theater building. There stood a bathtub carved from a single piece of marble, with faucets in the form of swans made of gold and silver. The plumbing system was a technical marvel of that time, hot water supplied around the clock. But this luxury was sterile. In this bathtub, Fisk washed off not only the street dirt, but also the dirt of his deals. And the more he washed, the dirtier he felt. The irony was that Jim Fisk, owning a palace, was essentially homeless. He had a legal wife, Lucy, who lived in Boston. She was a quiet, modest woman who refused to move to this New York Babylon. Fisk visited her, showered her with money, but his real home was here, in the office, among folders of stocks and bird cages. He had built himself a golden cage, locked himself inside, and thrown away the key. In the beginning of 1872, the walls of the Grand Opera House began to press on him. The huge windows overlooking 8th Avenue seemed like battlements of a besieged fortress. Below, on the street, newspapers were already being sold with details of his lawsuit with Stokes. Every stone of his palace was paid for with the money of investors he had deceived, and now those stones cried out for retribution. The grandeur of the interiors only emphasized the insignificance of what was happening. Marble nymphs on the walls looked at their master with silent reproach. The architecture of power that Fisk created was designed for triumph, but it was completely unsuitable for defense. It was too fragile, too ostentatious. When Edward Stokes decided to strike, he did not storm these oak doors. He simply lured the owner outside. And at the moment when Fisk left his marble cocoon and stepped onto the sidewalk, he instantly turned from Lord of the Universe into an ordinary, vulnerable man of flesh and blood. His palace remained standing, cold and indifferent, ready to receive a new master as soon as the body of the old one cooled. Great empires do not die from the blow of a barbarian's sword. They die from within. Like termites that gnaw at the load-bearing beams of a palace for years, so vices, secrets, and compromises with conscience ate away at the foundation of the Gilded Age. By the end of 1871, the air around Jim Fisk had become stale. It was the smell of rot. And it came not from New York sewers, but from the system he helped create. To understand why the shot was inevitable, we need to look at what was happening behind the scenes of political life. Jim Fisk was never an independent figure. He was part of an ecosystem known as the Tammany Hall Gang. At the head of this food chain stood William Boss Tweed, the man who effectively owned New York. Tweed sat on the board of directors of the Erie Railroad, ensuring legal immunity for Fisk and Gould. In return, they financed his corrupt machine. But in the fall of 1871, Tweed's colossus collapsed. The New York Times began publishing exposés about the theft of public money. Boss Tweed was arrested. Suddenly, Jim Fisk discovered that his roof had leaked. Judges who had previously dined with him at Delmonico's now crossed to the other side of the street. Politicians stopped replying to letters. Fisk was left one-on-one with the law he had always despised. In this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, that very court case began, which turned the personal life of the Prince of Erie inside out. This was not just a blackmail proceeding. This was a public flogging. The courtroom turned into a cheap sideshow. Newspaper reporters savored every detail. The main weapon against Fisk was not financial documents, but his own love letters. When Stokes's lawyers began reading them aloud, the room erupted in laughter. It was a sound that hurt Fisk more than a bullet. People were not laughing at the businessman. They were laughing at the lovesick fool. In the letters, the formidable magnate called himself Little Pudgy and complained of indigestion. He described his sufferings with the sentimentality of a schoolboy. The image of the almighty admiral crumbled to dust. The public saw not a titan, but a lonely, insecure fat man who tried to buy love with railroad stocks. This was social desacralization. The magic of money stopped working. If they laugh at a king, he is no longer a king. But the most repulsive rot was exposed when the household staff took the witness stand. Josie Mansfield's maid, Emma Keislich, gave testimony that forever destroyed the reputation of all participants in the drama. She told the court how Edward Stokes, this gentleman from high society, hid in closets and behind portieres when Fisk unexpectedly visited his mistress. She described how Stokes and Josie drank wine sent by Fisk, ate oysters paid for by Fisk, calling him a fat pig and cash cow at the same time. These details shocked even cynical New York. This was a picture of absolute moral decay. There were no heroes here, only dirt. Stokes appeared as a gigolo and parasite, Josie as a calculating predator, and Fisk as a pathetic cuckold who paid for mockery of himself. Far from this circus, in Boston, was another victim of this story, Jim's legal wife, Lucy Fisk. She lived in the shadows, receiving generous checks and newspaper clippings about her husband's escapades. Her silence was deafening. While Jim played admiral and lover in New York, Lucy maintained the appearance of propriety, attending church and pretending nothing was happening. This double life, the rift between the saintly wife in Boston and the sinful mistress in New York, tore at Fisk's psyche. He rushed between these worlds, finding no peace anywhere. His binges grew heavier, and his bouts of gluttony became more uncontrollable. He drowned stress with dozens of eggs and pounds of steaks, hastening his end even without the help of a bullet. By January 1872, the situation had heated to the extreme. The grand jury, despite Tweed's fall, was still under the influence of Fisk's money. It became known that they were preparing to indict Edward Stokes for blackmail and extortion. This meant prison. A long, dirty stretch in Sing Sing. For Stokes, this was the point of no return. Rot had eaten away at his mind as well. He was ruined, humiliated in court, where his role as a gigolo was exposed, and now faced the prospect of becoming a felon. His narcissism could not endure this. He convinced himself that he was the victim. In his inflamed brain, Fisk was not the benefactor he had betrayed, but a monster who wanted to destroy him. The psychological portrait of the killer was composed of despair and vanity. Stokes did not want to kill for money. There was no money left. He wanted to kill to stop this endless shame, to silence that laughter that had echoed in the courtroom. He wanted to wipe from the face of the earth the cause of his woes. That morning of January 6th, Jim Fisk looked especially tired. He complained to his valet about bad premonitions, but, as always, brushed them off, putting on his best diamond. He did not know that the mechanism of destruction had already been set in motion. The rot behind the facade had reached critical mass. The structure of their relationships, this triangle of lies, money, and sex, could no longer stand. It had to collapse, and the debris had to crush everyone. That day, Jim went to the Grand Central Hotel for a reason. He was going to visit the widow of a famous journalist, Mrs. Morse, whose daughter was also embroiled in financial troubles. Even at this moment, under the crossfire of courts and press, he tried to play the role of a noble savior handing out money. This was his last role. The facade still shone, but behind it already stood death in the face of a young, handsome man in an elegant coat. The hands of the clock in the lobby of the Grand Central Hotel showed 4 hours and 7 minutes in the afternoon. It was the time when winter twilight begins to envelop New York, blurring the outlines of buildings. James Fisk entered the lobby, humming some tune. He asked the porter if Mrs.
Morse and her daughter were home, and upon receiving an affirmative answer, headed to the ladies' staircase. He walked lightly for a man of his build, driven by the habit of always being in motion. But this time, the motion led him straight into a trap. At the top of the staircase stood Edward Stokes. Witnesses would later say that he was pale as a sheet, and his eyes feverishly gleamed. He waited. When Fisk ascended a few steps, their gazes met. At that moment, the entire history of their relationship flashed between them, from drunken parties in the opera to hatred in the courtroom. Stokes extended his hand. In his palm lay a 4-barreled Colt House pistol. It was a compact, vicious weapon that easily hid in a coat pocket. The first shot rang out like a whip crack. The bullet struck Fisk in the left arm, above the elbow. The giant staggered, but did not fall. He froze, looking at his killer with an expression of childlike bewilderment. He could not believe that the rules of the game had been broken so crudely. Stokes cocked the trigger a second time. The second shot was fatal. The bullet entered the abdomen, just above the navel and to the right of center, pierced the intestine, and lodged in the thigh bone. "Stokes has killed me," Fisk cried out, clutching the railing to keep from tumbling down. His voice, usually thunderous and cheerful, was now full of horror. He slumped onto the steps. Hotel staff rushed to him. They lifted him. 6 men struggled to carry this enormous, limp body and carried him to the nearest vacant room, number 213. And it is here that the second, even more terrible part of the tragedy begins. It was not only Edward Stokes's bullet that killed Jim Fisk. It was the medicine of 1872. Doctors crowded into the room. Dr. Tripp arrived first, followed by luminaries of New York surgery, Drs. James Wood and Louis Sayre. In those years, the germ theory of Pasteur and Lister already existed, but many American doctors considered it eccentricity. They did not wash their hands before examination. They did not sterilize instruments. Their main goal was to find and extract the bullet at any cost. Jim lay on the bed, his face gray, his breathing labored. The doctors took out a Nelaton probe, a long metal rod with a porcelain tip, and began inserting it into the wound. Without anesthesia, without disinfection. They probed the wound channel again and again, trying to feel the lead. Each movement of the probe tore tissues and carried infection deeper into the abdominal cavity. They turned a wound that might have been treatable with rest and cleanliness into guaranteed peritonitis. Fisk groaned, his mighty body shuddering in pain.
but the doctors continued their torture, convinced they were saving him. Meanwhile, word of the shooting reached the Grand Opera House. Jay Gould, the man considered devoid of emotions, dropped everything and rushed to the hotel. When he entered room 213 and saw his partner dying on blood-soaked sheets, Gould's icy mask cracked. Eyewitnesses claimed that the Mephistopheles of Wall Street cried. He sat at the bedside, holding Fisk's hand, and whispered words of comfort. It was a scene of farewell between two pirates whose ship had gone down. The coroner and police representatives arrived in the room. They needed a dying declaration. Fisk, pumped full of morphine and brandy, could barely move his tongue, but his mind was clear. When the arrested Stokes was brought into the room for identification, Fisk looked at him with a long, heavy gaze. "Is this the man who shot you?" the coroner asked. "Yes," Fisk rasped. "It's Stokes." Stokes stood silently, wrapping himself in his coat, and looked at the work of his hands. There was no remorse in his eyes, only the fear of a cornered beast. He was taken away to the Tombs prison, where he would spend the coming years fighting for his life now against the executioner. The night at the Grand Central Hotel was long. A crowd of thousands gathered around the hotel. People stood in the snow, gazing at the lit windows on the second floor. There, inside, an era was dying. Fisk deliried. He imagined he was back on the exchange, issuing orders again. He called for his wife, Lucy, who was racing by train from Boston, but did not make it in time. He called for Josie, the woman who became the cause of his end, but her name stuck in his throat. By morning of the 7th of January, Fisk's condition became critical. Infection had spread throughout his body. Shock and blood loss did their work. At 10 hours 45 minutes in the morning, James Fisk Jr. took his last breath. His heart, which had withstood Black Friday, endless banquets, and court battles, stopped. As soon as the doctor pronounced death, a silence hung in the room that seemed louder than cannon fire. Jay Gould stood up, wiped his eyes, and became again the cold calculator the world knew. He understood. With Fisk's departure, the shield had fallen. Now all the public's and the law's fury would fall on him. He left the hotel through the back entrance, leaving the body of his only friend to the care of the undertakers. Fisk's death became the emotional peak of the decade. It was not just the murder of a celebrity, it was the crash of the myth of money's invulnerability. The man who owned railroads and steamships died like a homeless dog, from the bullet of a loser and the dirty hands of surgeons. His millions could not buy him even a minute of life. His diamond, which he loved so much, was removed from the blood-soaked shirt and handed over for safekeeping as evidence. At the moment when the body was carried out of the hotel, New York changed. The merry, mad, riotous phase of the Gilded Age ended. In its place came a period of cold cynicism and heavy hangover. Jim Fisk, the Prince of Erie, departed, leaving behind mountains of debts, a weeping widow, and a legend that would live longer than any of his financial schemes. But while the coffin was being loaded onto the hearse, no one yet knew what awaited the empire he had built. What awaited it was complete and final disintegration. Jim Fisk's funeral became his last, most grandiose show. New York, which had laughed at him in the courtroom just yesterday, now wept. 20,000 people lined Broadway. Newspapers, which had caricatured him for years, came out with black borders, calling him a man with a broad soul. The regiment he commanded marched to drumbeat, and even the horses seemed crestfallen. But as soon as the last clod of earth fell on his grave in Brattleboro, Vermont, what always follows the death of a king without an heir began: plundering.
This was the ruthless mathematics of the curse. As soon as the body cooled, the shocking truth emerged. The Prince of Erie was a naked emperor. His fortune, estimated in millions during his life, proved a fiction on paper. Most of his assets were in the company's name, pledged or double-pledged. The real estate he was so proud of belonged to the railroad. His widow, Lucy Fisk, arriving from Boston, discovered that all she inherited were debts and a collection of tasteless items that now meant nothing without the charisma of their owner. But the real catastrophe erupted at the Grand Opera House. Fisk's death knocked the props out from under Jay Gould. Fisk had been his shield, his megaphone, his attack dog. Left alone, the quiet and universally hated Gould did not last even 2 months. In March 1872, the Erie coup occurred. A group of enraged shareholders, led by one-legged General Daniel Sickles, a Civil War hero and a man even more boisterous than Fisk himself, literally stormed the fortress on 23rd Street. They burst into the Holy of Holies, into that very office with the canaries. Jay Gould, barricaded inside, tried to hold the defense with a squad of police, but the power was not on his side. He was forced to sign his resignation. The great schemer was overthrown. Grand Opera House, the symbol of their power, was captured by enemies. The new owners immediately began the purge. The auction scenes that followed resembled the division of spoils by barbarians. Jim Fisk's personal belongings went under the hammer. It was a pitiful sight. His famous admiral's uniforms with gold epaulets, which he wore with such pride, were sold as theatrical props. His gold cufflinks, his canes with ivory handles, his collection of carriages, all this went for a song. The special cynicism of the situation was lent by the sale of live goods. Hundreds of canaries, whose singing he loved so much, were sold for $1 apiece, or simply released into the wild, where they perished in the cold of the New York winter. His famous team of 6 black and white horses was split up and sold to different cabmen. The empire, built on bling, was dismantled into souvenirs. And what about the killer? The fate of Edward Stokes became the brightest illustration of how justice worked for the rich. He stood trial 3 times. At the first trial, the jury could not reach a verdict. At the second, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging. It seemed justice had triumphed. Stokes sat in the death cell, listening to the carpenters building the gallows in the yard of the Tombs prison. But the Stokes family still had money. Huge money. They hired the best appellate lawyers, found procedural errors, and secured a 3rd trial. The 3rd time, the verdict was reduced to manslaughter. Instead of the noose, Stokes got 4 years in prison. And this was not just any prison. His incarceration in Sing Sing more resembled a vacation in a strict regime sanatorium. He lived in a separate cell, the floor of which was covered with Persian rugs. He was allowed to wear civilian clothes. Food was delivered to him from New York's best restaurants, and in the evenings, he drank wine and received guests. The corruption that Fisk had so skillfully used ultimately saved his killer's life. Stokes was released in 1876. He tried to return to business, bought the famous Hoffman House, and even got rich for a time, but the shadow of the murder haunted him. He became paranoid, saw enemies everywhere, and died in 1901, forgotten and alone, suffering from Bright's disease. The third corner of the triangle, Josie Mansfield, met perhaps the saddest fate: oblivion. After the trial, where her name was dragged through the mud, she became persona non grata in America. No decent house would open its doors to her. She fled to Europe.
There, in Paris, she tried to preserve the remnants of her former luxury, but years and extra weight took their toll. The woman for whom the King of Wall Street was shot ended her days in 1931. She died in complete poverty in a small apartment as a very old woman. Neighbors did not even know that this fat woman feeding cats had once been the Cleopatra of 23rd Street, capable of crashing the stock market with a flutter of her eyelashes. The widow Lucy Fisk lived a long life, dying only in 1912. She never remarried. Until the end of her days, she remained faithful to the memory of her husband, who cheated on her in plain view. She lived on a modest pension allocated to her by Jim's friends, and every year, on the day of his death, ordered a memorial service.
By the end of the 70s of the 19th century, not a stone remained of the Erie Empire. The railroad wallowed in debts and reorganizations. The golden sheen faded, revealing rust. The Great Depression of 1873, which began a year after Fisk's death, finally buried the era of mad speculations. The world changed. In place of bright adventurers like Fisk, came cold industrial magnates like Rockefeller and Morgan, men in gray suits who killed competitors not with revolvers, but with dumping and tariffs. The sale of Jim Fisk's property became the symbolic finale of the wild stage of capitalism. His death showed that even the biggest money does not grant immortality, and the loudest fame lives exactly until the next morning's newspaper edition. Only an echo remained, and we still hear this echo today if we listen to the noise of the city.
If today you find yourself in New York and decide to walk along West 23rd Street in the Chelsea area, you will most likely not even slow down near house number 260. This massive building looks tired. On the first floor, there is a popular chain pharmacy and several unremarkable stores. Yellow taxis, couriers on electric bicycles, and tourists hurrying to the High Line Park rush past. But stop. Raise your head. There, high above the plastic signs and air conditioners, on the pediment, one can still make out the inscription carved in stone. Grand Opera House. And if you have good eyesight, you will see the intertwined letters E and R. Erie Railroad. This is that very modern anchor we spoke of at the beginning. This is the only physical reminder that here, within these walls, a century and a half ago, beat the heart of America's most scandalous financial empire. Where today toothpaste and vitamins are bought, James Fisk planned the takeover of the U.S.
gold market, and Josie Mansfield wrote her fateful letters. The building survived, but its spirit has dissipated. After Fisk's death and Gould's exile, the theater for several decades tried to maintain its status, but gradually sank to showing cheap vaudevilles, then became an RKO cinema, and in 1960, the majestic auditorium was gutted, turned into ordinary warehouse spaces and apartments. The marble that remembered the steps of Diamond Jim was painted over with cheap paint or destroyed. However, if we want to find a living connection to that era, we need to look not at the walls, but at television screens. Remember Fisk's enemy, old Commodore Vanderbilt, whom Jim so merrily deceived with the printing press. The Commodore's blood still influences American media reality today. The famous CNN anchor Anderson Cooper is a direct descendant of Cornelius Vanderbilt, his great-great-great-grandson. Every time you see Cooper on air, you are looking into the eyes of the dynasty against which our hero fought. The Vanderbilts became part of the establishment,
their name carved on the facades of universities and stations. And Fisk's name? It remains only in anecdotes and court records. This holds the main irony of fate. Jay Gould, Fisk's partner, died one of the richest men in the world, leaving a fortune that, in modern terms, amounts to tens of billions. His descendants still enter society's elite. Jim Fisk left behind neither a dynasty, nor a foundation, nor a university. His grave is in the city of Brattleboro, state of Vermont. The monument ordered by his family impresses with its disproportion. It is a huge obelisk surrounded by 4 female statues symbolizing railroads, navigation, commerce, and charity. But local residents say that these stone maidens rather mourn lost investments than the deceased himself. Nevertheless, James Fisk Jr.
left us something more important than money. He left us an archetype. He was the first in history celebrity CEO. Before him, the rich hid behind high fences. Fisk was the first to understand that wealth is a performance. Look at modern billionaires. When you see Elon Musk, who writes provocative tweets crashing stocks, or Donald Trump, who turned his name into a brand written in gold letters on skyscrapers, you see direct spiritual heirs of Jim Fisk. He invented this style, being loud, being omnipresent, turning his life into a reality show long before the advent of television. He proved that for a certain type of public, audacity is more attractive than competence, and vivid lies sell better than boring truth. Fisk was a prophet of the consumer era. He showed that the market is not rational, it is emotional.
People bought Erie stocks not because the railroad was profitable, it was not, but because they wanted to touch the magic of the man who rode in a carriage with a 6-horse team and lived with an actress. The story of the murder of the Prince of Erie is a warning that remains relevant even in 2025. We live in a world where the boundaries between business, politics, and entertainment are completely erased. Jim Fisk was a pioneer of this world, but his end reminds us of the price of such a lifestyle. In the first part, we talked about the paradox. The richest man dies in the dirt, having in his pocket only a handful of change and a shot-through intestine. The circle closed. Money is the most powerful energy, but it does not protect from physics. A .32 caliber bullet weighs only a few grams, but it outweighed all the locomotives, all the steamships, and all the millions of the Erie Railroad.
When Jim Fisk was being buried, someone from the crowd said a phrase that became an epitaph not only for him, but for the entire Gilded Age. He lived life as if tomorrow would never come. And he was right. For him, it did not come. Today, looking at the facade of the Grand Opera House on 23rd Street, we see not just old brick. We see a monument to human vanity. Empires collapse, stocks depreciate, diamonds go under the hammer to new owners who do not even know the names of the former masters. Only history remains.